Excellent. Right, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Amnesty International Orkney Group and Orkney Friends of Palestine, we'd like to welcome you all here tonight, those who are with us in person, and also those who are with us online. We are delighted to have members of Parliament Layla Moran and Alistair Carmichael joining us tonight to discuss a crucial topic, the current situation in Gaza. Now, I'll let our technical team explain how we're going to manage the questions so that everyone around the world can hear what's going on. Go ahead, Angus.
Hello, yep, so I'm on the technical team. Mike is in charge, and we have a Zoom operator down the end, so it's all being recorded and going out on Zoom. So when it comes to the end, when we have the questions, everybody put your hand up and get the question. If you can wait for me to arrive with the microphone so we can get it on the recording and get it out on Zoom. And if you can feel the second question coming, hang on to it, don't hand it over and then ask your second question. You will be there. Right, good. All right.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'll just say that Layla Moran has been the MP for Oxford West and Abington since 2017, and she speaks for the Liberal Democrats on international affairs and international development, well, foreign and Commonwealth affairs, I guess. Alistair Carmichael has been our MP here in Orkney and Shetland since 2001, and he's the Liberal Democrat spokesman on justice, home affairs, and Northern Ireland. So thank you both so much for coming tonight, and I'll just let Alistair say a few words before we start. I just want to mention that we are time limited tonight because they have another engagement after this, so we have an hour. So after their opening remarks, we'll open it up to questions and answers. But Alistair, we can start.
Okay. Nadia, thank you very much. Can I just say, first of all, how tremendous it is to see such a full room here this evening. Actually, you know, when we go back to Westminster, to be able to say that we were talking about this in Orkney and that we had, in the old Laura Grimmond maxim, extra chairs had to be brought into the room, actually is a very powerful message to say that this is something that matters to people, the length and breadth of the country. So thank you for turning out here. I'm not going to say an awful lot because I know you've come to hear Layla. Just a few thoughts though. You know, we're talking about the current situation in Gaza. I've no idea. I can't imagine what it's like. I was talking to a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours the other day, who told me that he had lost 42 members of his family in Gaza since the Israeli invasion. And, you know, just holding that thought in your mind for a second, that's just one person, 42 members, some of them as close as first cousins for him. And I was, well, the only time I've actually been in Gaza was the first time I visited Palestine. It was in 2007. It was just after Hamas had taken control. And what I saw then was pretty brutal. It was pretty shocking. I described it at the time, and I've described it since, as being like moonscape. And, you know, I think we seem to have seen a determined effort to keep bombing rubble until it's dust. You can see the present situation as being one of despair or one with a measure of hope. It feels like British foreign policy and the foreign policy of so much in the West will always do the right thing for Palestine, but only once they've tried everything else first. So the glacial pace of progress that we've seen over the last few months has been incredibly frustrating. But we have now got to the place where we've got a United Nations Security Council motion, a resolution, in fact, which calls for an immediate ceasefire. Because, you know, whatever you do then, nothing gets better until the bombing and the shooting stops. So if we now get to that place where there is a ceasefire, then there might be a hope. I've heard Layla speak about this in the recent past, where she talks of it as an opportunity. And it's difficult to see it as an opportunity, but I know exactly what she means, and it is that surely this is a moment where we have the attention of the world, and we have got to get people of goodwill together to see that we're never going to come back to this point at all, and that the purpose of a ceasefire has got to be to get a political process which will get us to a two-state solution. Because the great misunderstanding of this whole thing on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu and others, particularly in our own government, is to think that there's ever going to be a military solution to this conflict, or that there will be a military solution to the threat posed by Hamas. That's just not going to happen. It's like playing whack-a-mole. You knock them down here and they pick up somewhere else. But a political solution which ultimately allows Israelis and Palestinians to live in two states side by side has got to be the only resolution that you will ever find any permanence in peace. And by peace I mean something more than just an absence of conflict. A word about Layla. Layla is our first British parliamentarian of any party who is of Palestinian heritage. She speaks, I think, with a particular authority and a personal involvement and a commitment as a consequence of that in a debate which has been frustrating in recent months for all sorts of reasons. She has produced a line and an analysis which I think it offers us a bit of hope, because it is founded in genuine compassion and a commitment, instead of using it as a political football, but to focus everyone's attention on the achieving of a two-state solution, the ending of the bombing and the violence. I'm enormously proud of having Layla as a colleague. So can I ask you please to give her an enormously warm Orkney welcome at Layla Moran.
Well, first of all, thank you. I honestly think, and I will be speaking to my family, both the diaspora family, but also those in Jerusalem and those who are connected to the distant family that I've got in Gaza. When I tell them that I went to Orkney and show them where that is on the map, and then describe how many people came to hear about this, it genuinely means so much. And the solidarity and the compassion and the passion with which people have taken the Palestinian cause into their hearts over the last few months, simply by being here, you are helping. I just wanted to make that very clear, and just to say an enormous thank you to you all for taking an interest and caring. Because we need people to care. And I'll come on to the hope and all of the rest of it, but I'm sorry to say I'm going to have to go through a bit of despair before we get to the hope, because we are in an awful situation. When I speak about this, I always start with a little bit of my own family history. So to explain about me, I'm the first of Palestinian heritage. I'm actually the first of any kind of Arab heritage at all, which I find remarkable. And I equally find it remarkable that I'm in Parliament at this time. I entered politics because I was a physics teacher and wanted to do stuff about education and children. And I never thought that I would be in a position where I had to speak about this issue at this point. And there's a sense of fate about it. And I take the responsibility of my heritage very, very seriously. Because in the end, one day I'll stop being a parliamentarian, but I'll always be a Palestinian. And I need to know that I did the best for my people when I had this voice. The story of my family in this began, as all Palestinian families, in 1948. We are a Christian Palestinian family. Some people recently have found that confounding. I never understood why it was confounding that, Jesus was born there. So you'd think some people might have, cottoned on. But we are from Jerusalem. We're a very old Jerusalem family. Our local church is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was crucified, and then the resurrection is called the Resurrection Church otherwise. And it's the most incredible, incredible place. I was in Jerusalem just recently, and because of this conflict, there was no one there, which is amazing. If anyone's ever been, It's usually characterized by not being able to get through the front door, and yet it was empty, which I felt itself was an allegory for what is happening right now to the region. Jerusalem, the cradle of 3 world religions, and there's nothing. And that is all because of what is happening in Gaza. And we are in a moment where we can hopefully change the future, but the past has been bleak. Guterres was right. This didn't happen in any kind of, in a vacuum. We were in 48, we left Jerusalem. There was the bombing of the King David Hotel. The family home was just round the corner. I had the ability to visit it about a year ago, and it's now a place that has been taken over. It was taken over in 48 by a Jewish family. It was then sold. It's now a hall where they celebrate bar and bat mitzvahs. And, you know, under right of return, maybe one day we'd come back, but let's face it, probably not. And all I felt was this extraordinary sadness. My great-grandfather spoke about Jerusalem in the time prior to 48, and actually there was a lot of love, frankly, between the different communities in Jerusalem, between the Muslims and the Christians, but also the Jews. And it was a more than coexistence. They genuinely worked together. And there were old families from all 3 faiths that would call themselves Jerusalemites and who just happened to have different religions in the sort of way that we might understand it here in the UK. But then in 48, everything changed. And ever since that point, we became refugees. The State of Israel was born. The very same day that Israel celebrates its Independence Day, its creation, is the day that we commemorate us becoming refugees in what we call the Nakba, which is called the catastrophe in Arabic. It means the expulsion of families like mine from their ancestral homes. Ours went to Jericho, where my mother sort of grew up, and then they went on to Amman after that. My grandparents ended up settling in Greece, and this is a very normal story for a Palestinian family. My mother met my dad, and here I am. And so I feel very linked back to 1948. I feel like there is an unfinished thread in my family. And the end of that thread is the 2-state solution. It is not the 1-state solution, I don't think. I'd love the idea that we'd go back to that completely, almost secular land where you could have all those communities living together in peace and harmony. But look, much as there are many people who believe that and want that, I just think that's a step too far. I think we are now at the point, given the violence, given the successive rounds over many decades, that the only way through this now is separation. We need a Palestinian state. It was what was promised to us by the British, by the way. We'll remember the Balfour Declaration of 1917. This isn't something that Britain can just say we have nothing to do with. My great-grandfather worked for the mandate. And in his diaries, he at the end said he hated the British more than the Jews, because the British promised that in the creation of the State of Israel, they would create the State of Palestine and give them safety as well. And he felt completely let down by the British. So our country, specifically our country, not just the world, but our country, has a responsibility to the Palestinian people to play a leading role in what happens next. So Gaza. So October the 7th happens, and I remember it very well. My partner and I were at a car boot sale. I remember seeing a text and then tweets. Oh my God, what's just happened? We begin to see the reports of what comes in. I realized that actually some of the places that were being attacked were kibbutz in southern Israel that I'd visited. And I was just astounded by the scale of it. I actually never thought Hamas would ever have the logistics to be able to do something like this. It was confounding. My first thought was Iran must be involved, because Iran are the paymasters of Hamas. And my second thought was, and I'm no fan of Hamas, I need to make this very clear. My family have never had anything to do with Hamas. Especially their tactics. There's a difference between sort of resistance within your own country, but this is something else. This is just terrorism, plain and simple. When you go in to kill innocent people who have had nothing to do with this, and in fact, many of those who live in the kibbutz who were attacked were peace activists. And these are the people who were on the side of Palestinians. These are the people who were calling out apartheid and the occupation and everything else. That's who Hamas decided to kill. And I found it disgusting. And so when I went back it was about 2 months ago, I visited again, and I met some of those people who were relatives of those who were killed, who themselves had, helped to bury some of those who had rockets thrown at them by Hamas. And they said to me they wanted to continue that voice of peace. I met one whose parents were killed with bazookas. So Hamas came in with bazookas. They put 2 bazookas into his house, and his parents were killed instantly. One's a teacher who lives in London. His brother works out of Tel Aviv and is now dedicating his entire life. He stopped doing what he was doing, which was running a hostel, and he's dedicated his entire life to saying to his fellow Israelis, we can't live like this anymore. We can't keep doing this. We can't keep having these cycles of violence. And perhaps it's because they are so close to Gaza, because they can see, and they had friends there, and they have childhood memories of going. And for those who've been, I've not been to Gaza, but for those who have, I understand it's beautiful. It's like going to Greece. It's beaches, and it's, lovely fish, and it's gorgeous, and it's full of arts and crafts, and it's a town that's by the sea that is stunning. And many of these families would go for picnics there, and they would have friends who were there, and they would integrate in that way. And these are the people who are saying, we can't have this anymore. But these are also the people who have been out on the streets campaigning against Netanyahu for months. Netanyahu is responsible for what is happening now. He is both responsible for, in my view, the recruiting ground that was created that Hamas could draw from, both within Gaza, but also look at what's happening in the West Bank. Please let's not forget what's happening in the West Bank, the taking of political prisoners, the increase of the settlements. And not only does Netanyahu not want a two-state solution. By the way, this isn't new news. You might have seen, the BBC recently said, oh my God, Netanyahu said he doesn't want 2 states. Netanyahu has never wanted 2 states. Netanyahu was the man who was inciting the violence against Yitzhak Rabin, who was the last Israeli prime minister who genuinely wanted peace. Netanyahu has never been the partner of peace, so I don't know why people were confused about this. But the thing that is new is the influence of his ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And for those who are unaware of those 2 names, I suggest you go and look them up. They're not the only ones who like to talk in genocidal terms about Palestinians. There are others available. Gallant, for example, called us human animals, and that he wanted to go in and eliminate everything. But Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are characters who are born from the settler movement in Israel. And the settler movement in Israel is a small part of the population. They are very extreme. They are far right. They are nihilistic in the same way that Hamas are. They believe that the whole of the Palestinian land is the home of the Jews. It's the historic home of the Jews. And the reason why they put the settlements where they are is part of a wider project to stop the creation of a Palestinian state and ultimately to have a whole of Israel across the whole of the land. So these aren't partners to peace either. Mm-hmm. So as soon as October the 7th happens, I think to myself, those poor people, 1,200 people died, hostages taken, awful. But in the same breath, you know exactly what's going to happen next, because here is the opportunity for those extremists in the Israeli government to use this as an excuse to do what they've always said they wanted to do. And that is what's being called out by the International Court of Justice. And that is why I believe the International Criminal Court, in addition to going after Hamas, needs to be going after people like Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich. And they should be tried and thrown in jail for what they are doing. Because the situation in Gaza There are no words. I struggle. I just struggle. I'm not a lawyer. People talk about war crimes, and you read the Genocide Convention and you read the other conventions and you think to yourself, does this, doesn't it? I don't know. And there are arguments on all sides, as you will always have when there's a lawyer. But what I will say is it's morally wrong. It's morally wrong. And that's where I think politicians can speak out. It's not okay that 30,000 Palestinians are now dead. It is not okay, most of them women and children. It is not okay that babies in incubators are dying because they can't get medical treatment. It is not okay. On the other end of the spectrum, and my family's lucky, I've got family in the churches, one of the churches in northern Gaza. There are very few Christians left in Gaza, but they're there. And they've been there the whole time. Their house was bombed in the first week. What the churches did is they put on buses to go round Gaza City so that anyone who wanted to get on and seek refuge in the church was able to do that. And so they went, and it's 2 grandparents, parents, and twin boys. And the oldest male figure, Frey, died because he had a ruptured gallbladder and needed an operation and couldn't get it. And it should have been simple. It should have been something that he could have gone down to the local hospital, got sorted out and come out. And because there just wasn't access to basic health care, that's when we lost the first member of our family. And now we are facing famine. A famine that the International Court of Justice said shouldn't be happening. A famine that is being characterized as using starvation as a weapon of war. And quite rightly, people across the world are looking at what's happening in Gaza and they're asking themselves the question, how are we allowing this? How is this okay? And the answer to that question of the how is this okay is it is not. Why are we allowing this? Perhaps more complex. The short answer to that question, how are we allowing this, in my view, is that we need stronger international institutions to hold those who are breaking international law to account much earlier. You can't understand Gaza without understanding the occupation, the way that Palestinians have been asked to live for the last 50 years, the way that we are now seeing the settlements proliferate with impunity. To not understand that context and not understand that basically what we have is a situation where the Israeli government will ask Palestinians to live in such a way that so very clearly seems to contravene international law, and yet they aren't being held to account. And the problem with that is that that affects all of us. It's not just about this one conflict anymore. This is now about the very basis of our international institutions and their ability to hold the world-based order to account against each other. This has implications for Russia, for Ukraine, for us, for China, you name it. All of these big things are playing into this conflict. And without understanding that is to misunderstand the situation in the Security Council. So the US has finally said to Netanyahu, enough is enough. Of course, that's not enough for them to vote for a ceasefire, but frankly, an abstention, I'll take an abstention. Just stop getting in the way of us stopping the killing. The ceasefire should have happened months ago. Alistair is completely right. And by the way, thank you for those of you who have supported Alistair. It's been a personal support to me. It's been a very, very difficult time, as you might imagine, with on the one hand, the personal stuff happening and losing members of family and wondering what happens next, and hearing that your people are potentially, going to be in court because there's a war crime of genocide being committed against them. So that's all happening in the personal background, and then having to carry this professionally has been incredibly difficult. So I thank Alistair sincerely, and I don't think I could do it without colleagues like him. But we need now support in Parliament for that immediate ceasefire. And the fact that America's finally got there is great, but Britain could have been stronger much, much sooner. And I think it has been pretty disgusting how you have seen Britain abstain again and again and again fine, let America have its veto. America's got its issues, it's got its own election, it's got its own thing, and we can talk about that some other time. We don't have time. But we, given our historic obligation as a country, shame on Britain, shame on Rishi Sunak for abstaining when it's so clear that there is a stain on our collective moral conscience that is happening in Gaza, and that whatever Hamas did does not justify what is happening now in Gaza. Two wrongs do not make a right. And the way to get the hostages out was also a ceasefire. I mean, it doesn't have to be either or. And the narrative that I think we should be all pushing back on is the idea of picking one side in this equation. I've completely rejected that. Many people have said, you're either pro-Israel or you are pro-Palestine. Well, I'm pro-peace. I will work with anyone who wants this to end. I will work with anyone who wants the killing to end. And I don't mean the killing right now, I mean the killing from the last 75 years. I want finally a situation where both peoples can live in security, in dignity, and in peace. And as Alistair rightly says, peace is not just the absence of conflict. Peace is an entirely different prospect that's going to take a lot of international energy to win. Now that path is going to be very, very difficult, but I would urge you all to please reject this narrative that you have to pick one. I'm pro-Palestinian, therefore I don't speak to anyone who's possibly Israeli, let alone Jewish, and that's just awful. It makes me ill, because I know many people, both in Israel and also who are Jews, who understand that this is not right. It's not what they want. They have bravely been going out on the streets calling for ceasefires, and they've been shouted down and in some cases arrested by their own government for doing it. So there are voices of peace on all sides of this equation. This is a fight between extremists and peacemakers. Mm-hmm. And once we understand who those extremists are, they are Hamas, they are Netanyahu, they are Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and who are the peacemakers? It's those people in the kibbutz, it's many of the people who are still hostages, it's the Palestinians who live in Nazareth who are trying to find another way and reach out across, even though they have many members, dozens of people in their own families being killed in Gaza. Those people have extraordinary strength and grace. And so in the international community, our job is to hold their hands through what is going to be the most difficult bit yet, which is to find the peace. And just this ending of hope. And it's a hope that comes from the same way that you find hope after a volcano erupts. When on the banks of a volcano, you often find the most fertile ground. And the reason for that is because you have complete scorched earth. The narratives of Palestine and Israel, you could see as almost the black and white of a photograph. One Independence Day is another's catastrophe. Every moment in history where you look at what's happened over the last 75 years, a good thing for one is a bad thing for the other. But at each of the moments where you have these huge eruptions of violence, there are always choices to be made, and there are lessons to be learned. And this is another one of these moments. For people in Israel, nothing will be the same prior to October the 7th. Mm-hmm. But the same is true of the Palestinian people. No longer is the world able to rest on its laurels, think that this situation is just going to go away, that we don't have to think about Israel-Palestine anymore, that actually, it sucks for the Palestinians, but whatever. And I thank you to groups like Orkney Friends of Palestine because you didn't forget. But we now need to harness the energy of those who are perhaps new to it, who have recently learned the history, and to all those politicians across the world who are looking at this and going, we don't want to get here again. It's going to take a huge amount of effort. I really hope the British Parliament leads on it. We're doing our best within it to try and push that narrative. But once again, I simply thank you because it is the energy from people like yourselves that is driving us to do better and more. And it is resonating back in Gaza and in Palestine for sure. So thank you very much for coming this evening and wanting to hear about and find a solution. Thank you. So happy to take questions.
Thank Thank you very much, Layla. That was a wonderful expose of the situation and your family history, which is all too traumatic, as all Palestinians have discovered. Right, so we still have time for some questions. So, yes, go ahead, and we'll have the speaker now.
It's your mouth. Thank you. You eloquently described how the British were the people who instigated this from 1917 on. And you eloquently described how they continued to, throughout the last few months, abstain from calling for a ceasefire. That isn't the end of it. We're still selling arms to Israel. Yeah. We are facilitating this atrocity. Even as we sit here, we are facilitating this atrocity and atrocities elsewhere in the world. Yes. When will we stop selling weapons to people? Weapons don't feed anybody. Yeah. They have no purpose other than to kill and mutilate.
So shall I take them one by one? Yeah. So I completely agree with you. We absolutely should not be selling arms to Israel whilst it is at risk of committing human rights abuses. And the policy that the Liberal Democrats have adopted is one that includes Israel but doesn't stop at Israel. There are nations across the world that are there's a list that the Foreign Office keeps called the Human Rights Priority List. And there's a whole long list. I would encourage you to read the report. It makes for very bleak reading, but I suspect that in this audience you might find it interesting and illuminating. And so it's not just Israel. There are a number of countries across the world where there is a heightened risk of them using those arms in order to actively commit human rights abuses within their own countries. The reason why I would hesitate to say don't sell arms to anyone is that I am a great supporter of Ukraine. And I do believe that when it comes to our NATO allies and when it comes to the war against Putin that he instigated against the democratic country of Ukraine, there are times when we do want to be supporting our allies, particularly in self-defense. So I'm sorry if people disagree with me on that, but I personally think that that is the right thing to do, and I think that NATO alliance right now is particularly important. But more broadly, I mean, we are in a world that feels more tumultuous than it was perhaps 10, 15 years ago. We have to understand that geopolitics has shifted. And in part, I think that's for two reasons. One, we need to re-legitimize the United Nations. Okay? We need to understand that the Security Council is not fit for purpose. How is it right that, yes, there's nuclear arms, and that's a whole thing, but it is not right that you've got the permanent members of the Security Council, of which Britain is one, of course, but then you've got important countries that aren't. And it makes no sense. How is it right that you have votes that go through the General Assembly that then are completely ignored by the Security Council? And all that's happening in a multipolar world where there are now, it's not just the one big player of America and everyone else. We now have a multipolar world where we've got several places where power is concentrated. We need to reimagine what the United Nations looks like in the modern sense, not how it was fit for purpose in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that hasn't happened. We have a stale international system, but one that I think I would defend with my life, because at moments like this, it is the only mechanism that is not a mechanism that involves killing that allows us to solve these problems. So why is it that we're in these positions? Why do we have to have NATO alliances and all the rest of it? It's in part because we don't have the international system that is fit for purpose. That doesn't mean we throw it away. It means we improve it, we defend it, and we talk about that, and we aren't afraid to talk about it. But until then, I'm afraid to say, we do need to be working with our allies. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to add to that.
The only thing I'd add to that, this shouldn't even be up for discussion at the moment, because Britain's policy is that we do not, or we have a presumption against the granting of export licenses where the country is on the watch list that Layla has referred to. So this, given what we know about what is happening in Gaza, this shouldn't even be up for discussion. What the government is doing is in blatant contradiction of its own policy. And I don't understand how it's okay on the one hand to insist that you have to have this very high level of proof to reinstate funding for UNRWA, for example,
Yes.
the relief agency, while at the same time saying that until you have this mathematical precision of judgment in respect of what Israel's doing, that you're not going to stop the arms sales. So there are massive, this is the history of the Middle East for decades now, massive number of contradictions and double standards at play. I mean, I remember in the debates running up to the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003, referring back to Resolution 242 of the Security Council about Palestine, and saying, there has to be some parity between the way in which resolutions are implemented, and why are we running head first to implement, I think it was 1441 at the time, when we're still forgetting that a resolution that has been on the books since 1967 it has been pretty much neglected.
Exactly.
Thank you. My question is also about arms. Sort of continues from the first question. You spoke about in your opening remarks about the need for people to care, and my question is, what about the arms manufacturers, the people that are at the top, the CEOs or whatever they're called? Do they care? Are they just simply passive in this? Do they have a red line that they won't cross?
Thank you. I mean, I certainly can't speak for them. All I can do is see what they do and assume. I mean, money corrupts, frankly. Whether they agree with it or not, I think they are there to answer to their shareholders. We have to understand the defence market. I mean, the amounts of money that are exchanging hands over arms is extraordinary amounts of money. And it is a key part of parts of our economy. And, actually people are now, in the context of Ukraine and Russia in particular, but also in the context of China and instability in the world, they are very concerned about, the supply chains and how are we going to manufacture more arms. And what I would say is this: no one is a fan of war. But actually, when in my role, and I've been to security conferences and I speak to diplomats and politicians, but I also speak to people very high up in armies across the world. The people who are fastest to talk about the paths to peace and the most realistic about that, and who actually on this issue have been the most sound, are the people who are serving in our armed forces. Because they know what it means to lose their lives to this. They know what war looks like. And they know that whilst they are sitting there with all the artillery behind them, the last thing they want to do is fire at anybody, because they know full well that those shells will just be coming back in some other form. And so when I speak to them about what's going on in Gaza, I struggle to find, even people who are high up in the US military, people who don't agree with the basic premise that this is not how you find peace. This is not how you avert more killing. This is not how you stop Hamas. They understand that, Hamas is as much an idea, and terrorism in general is an idea as much as it is an organization. And yes, it's true, we've got to deal with Iran. There are rogue state actors out there. Iran is one. They are actively giving arms and money to Hamas. But actually, what's the best way you can undermine Hamas? It's not to just stop that. It's also to give peace. If you want to take away the best recruiting tool from Hamas, have peace, have two-state solution. And the same goes for Iran. So people are beginning to change the way they're viewing this conflict. They're seeing it as a regional issue. They're seeing it as a security issue. So whilst there will be many here, myself included, who just see this as a self-determination issue, it's a historic injustice issue, it's a moral issue, frankly, if what it takes for governments to take this seriously is to see this as a security issue, how do you achieve Middle East peace? Start here. It would actually help to take the heat out of a lot else that's wrong in the region, including rogue state actors like Iran, who use it for their own nefarious means. And if that's what it takes to get them to do the right thing, I kind of don't care. I know what my outcome is, and I don't mind if people are doing it for the right reasons or some other reason. I just want that outcome, and that outcome is peace, 2 states, and no more killing. And for those people, if we need to clamp down on them, incentivize them, apply laws to them, then that's what we need to do. But a lot of those supply chains are managed by governments. So, I think we're in a good place in Parliament to pressure Rishi Sunak to do the right thing. And actually, my bigger question is, what is Rishi Sunak thinking? What does he think? And how does he think what's happening is okay? How did he ever think that what Britain was doing was okay? I don't understand his moral compass. And I think there's enormous questions to ask about that. And I'm sorry to say I'd apply the same questions to Keir Starmer.
Could I just...
Just leave it on.
Right. Okay. If I could just give a message to our audience watching online. If you happen to have any questions, then type them in the chat section and we can have someone ask them. Okay?
David Scott has asked, why do you think the Palestinians reject the UN partition plan in 1947? Was it a mistake?
Oh, goodness. Well, okay, I can answer this from the point of view of my great-grandfather's diaries, who talks about it from that perspective at the time. Bearing in mind, my family had never lived anywhere else. As far as we are aware, we are from Palestine for thousands of years. We have no idea if there was before that, we have no idea what it is. And can you imagine, from the point of view of Palestinians in that moment, who have lived there the whole of their lives, but the whole of their history, to be told by a bunch of white people elsewhere, without asking a single Palestinian, there was not one Palestinian in the room with that deal. Not one. They were never asked. That suddenly you have to give half of your country up? I understand from their perspective why they said no. I actually think it's a ridiculous question to ask if anyone that. I mean, if that was something that the world wanted, the way to have done it, and I'm not rejecting now that any kind of state, what I want now is 2-state solution based on 67 borders. And there is a lot of what-ifs in history. But I think it is a fool's errand to apply what we know now to what happened then. If you really want to have that conversation, I think there are lessons to be learned for how we solve this now. And one of them is to have Palestinians in the room. Mm-hmm. In 1947, no one asked them what they thought. If that's what they wanted to achieve, the way to do it wasn't an imposition. It was an explanation. It was where was the carrot for the Palestinians in any of this? Give up half your land for what? What positive was going to come from it? Where was the compensation? Where was the legitimacy in the eyes of the world? They could have been painted as the heroes. It could have been a completely different economic reality for Palestinians had the world wanted to give them that at the time. But that's not what happened. So if we're going to now ask Palestinians and Israelis to find that 2-state solution, it cannot just be sticks. I mean, so far, the way this conflict has been managed is stick after stick after stick, particularly for Palestinians. What's the carrot for Palestinians now? Mm-hmm. 2 states is not on its own is not enough. Okay? Beware. There are a lot of people who talk about, and I have the bill in Parliament for the recognition of the state of Palestine, but let's be very clear. Recognition of Palestine in of itself is not enough. It needs to be a recognition of the state of Palestine leading to a 2-state solution based on 67 borders. My fear is that we may find that various countries are going to recognize the state of Palestine and then it stops there. Mm-hmm. It's like, but look, you got your state. You know, now, but they're not going to remove the occupation, which is the thing that is stifling civil society. They're not going to give them the tools that they need. They're going to assume that all Palestinians are terrorists until they're proven otherwise, which is, you know, a very, very anti-Arab narrative, which I'm sorry to say still exists. So we've got to instead have them in the room, ask them what they need. You're going to build a state, we're going to help you. And moreover, we're going to be there for you, and we think that you have the right to security and dignity as much as anyone else in the world, as much as the Israelis. We're going to be there with you. So that's the lesson to learn. You have Palestinians at the heart of what comes next. You don't try and impose something from elsewhere. And many people will ask you the question, and they ask me the question all the time, how do we do this? Where do the roads go? Which borders do we use? What I'll tell you is this. People in Israel and Palestine know the answers to these questions. We are not going to solve those questions from Orkney or London or anywhere else. There are people who have lived through this. They know intimately the value of one bit of arable land versus another, where the wells are, how we're going to manage the road networks. They know, and they have the ideas that all of this is going to come from. What we need to do as an international community is to have faith in their humanity, to have faith in their intelligence, and to not assume that without us it's going to happen. We have to be there, and security is key, but not just security for Israel, security for Palestine as well.
Thanks. Thinking back, 20 years, I seem to remember 62 declarations by the United Nations that Israel was breaking the treaty. And yet they were toothless because of the American veto. Now that they've actually abstained, how can we actually get some teeth into the United Nations to act, to actually produce a positive result and get the Palestinians in the room? But Netanyahu has already said several times that he will not negotiate if Hamas is present. He seems to assume that everybody is Hamas if they are Palestinian. How can we negotiate or get people to negotiate without Zionist extremists like Netanyahu in the room, so that the ordinary Israeli Jewish population gets the chance to speak and have their say, as well as the ordinary Palestinians?
Thank you. So thank you for putting that in the way that you have, because actually I do believe that Netanyahu is an extremist, with Ben-Gvir, many around his cabinet table. It's worth saying, for those who are less familiar with Israeli politics, their left and right is not our left and right. Their left and right is more over the years, and this has changed over the years. Israel has been changing. It's partly demographic, but it's also partly, and it was described to me very powerfully by someone in what they call the peace camp in Israel, as having been a consequence of the assassination of Rabin, which is that many people had come to Israel, calling themselves Zionism, by the way, in of itself. There was a sort of violent Zionism, which my family suffered from in 48, but it came to mean simply the existence and the thriving of a state in Israel. And many people who are secular Israelis who believe in two states and peace will call themselves Zionists. That's their word. So we've just got to be very careful about that word. Some people will use it in a violent way, and some people, like this guy, would call himself a Zionist. But he was saying to me, the problem they have is that whilst he wants peace, he wants two states, he will fight for the rights of Palestinians, he wants a secular Israeli state which also treats Palestinians in Israel, and there are many of them, not least in the city of Nazareth, for example. They want all to be treated the same under the law, and they want complete change in Israel. But their political movement, unfortunately, has become very small, because after that assassination, they said, well, you know what, we keep losing. And now our main voice for peace has been assassinated, again by an extremist. So we're just going to shrink back. Many of them left the country. Many of them said, we're not going to engage in civil society. And many of them now realize that was a mistake. So for those of you who believe in Palestine, I would urge you to go find some of those voices. And they are there. You can find them on Twitter. They are Israelis who are bravely, out protesting against Netanyahu and these extremists, and are talking about ceasefire and talking about Palestinian rights. And they need defending, because they are coming under attack from within their own country. So I have faith. If those voices are there, if those kernels are there, they will grow. And our job is to not sort of lump everyone in together, because that diminishes them. Actually, the best thing that we can do is to find them and help to amplify them alongside those Palestinian voices that need amplification. The thing about Palestinian civil society is that is in a completely different place. So while I will go to Israel and I will have meetings with former generals in the Israeli army who talk about two-state solution and how to achieve it in peace, if you go and I did go to Ramallah and try to find partners for peace there, Palestinian civil society has been hugely diminished by laws that, for example, label NGOs in Palestine as terrorists, even though all they're doing is trying to apply international law. If you are someone who let's say I was in Palestine and wanted to start my own political party, the Palestinian Liberals, let's say, I'd be probably thrown in jail. They would find an excuse under military detention to keep me in jail for a long time. And if that wasn't enough the first time, they'd let me out and then they'd do it again. And then they'd maybe let me out and do it to someone in my... And for them, from their perspective, it's all about security, because, I would be anti-establishment and I'd be trying to do something. When actually, in any other country, what I'd be trying to do is just to have a democracy and a democratic debate within my own society. And that's all those people are trying to do. Some of them may well be terrorists, but actually a lot of them aren't. And so now people are talking about names like Marwan Barghouti. Some people may be familiar with this term. He was a Fatah, which is the sort of main political party in the West Bank in particular. He's much older, he's sort of the old guard, but he's someone who fits this bill, who was a prominent politician in Palestine, who was thrown in jail under military detention because he was seen as being dangerous. And I genuinely think there are now people in Israel who recognize that doing that was a mistake, because he's someone who could unite the Palestinian voice, who would have meant Hamas wouldn't have got in places like Gaza. And then when the Israelis say, we don't have a partner for peace, well, he would have been one of them. But he's not the only one. There are others. They exist. Some of them might be in jail, but some of them might be in Palestine as we speak and just are afraid to put their heads above the parapet. And some may well be in the diaspora and are waiting for their moment to come back. So I have faith in the Palestinian people, but I also have faith in parts of the Israeli society as well.
You said quite a lot about the two-state solution, but as someone who's been involved with kind of left-wing protest movements over quite a long time, I've noticed that it seems to become very fashionable for people on the left to cast aside the two-state solution and to treat it as being some kind of capitulation to a colonialist project. And I wondered what sort of arguments you'd put to them. And obviously there have been prominent MPs and certain party leaders who've had that opinion, and how do you sort of meet that and make the case that the two-state solution is actually the best one for Palestine?
Yeah. Thank you. You're right, and I mentioned it, I think, a bit in my remarks about, we have to understand there are people also in Palestine who are rejecting a two-state solution right now. You then have to ask the question, well, why? I can understand why my great-grandfather in 1947 rejected a two-state solution. I totally get it. I struggle more with why my generation would, given that all of us were born after 1967. We've seen the various rounds of negotiation. And the reason, in my view, that this has happened is because every time there has been a negotiation, Palestinians lose. You know, so they lose more and more and more. So every time there's a new round, every time someone says, you can have your state as part of a two-state solution, what they hear is you have to give up even more than you gave up before. So I get it. You know, the first point is I understand why there are people who are making this case. But then I also look at the landscape that surrounds this case. I'm uncomfortable with it on the one hand because the natural conclusion of what it is saying is that to not have two-state solutions means we have one. But which one? And so unless those people are happy to actively say that they want an end to the state of Israel, then I think they're lacking courage in their own argument, and I personally think that's a pretty abhorrent argument. I do not agree with that argument, as much as I am deeply hurt and saddened by what's happened to my people over the last 75 years. I do not believe that that is allowable. The only version of a one-state solution that I think is allowable is a secular state across the whole, now, and then this is my utopia, and actually this is actually what I would love, is a state called, not Israel, not Palestine, but Israel-Palestine, or Palestine-Israel, whatever. And you see this in parts of Israel. You can see it. There are two names on each of the towns. You kind of, you know, there are parts of Northern Ireland where this happens as well. They've got, yeah, Londonderry, exactly. So there's precedents for this, and you have a completely secular state where you've got Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Druze, you know, all the other religions, and people of no faith at all, who all live in the same land, who have equal rights under the same land, who are treated equally, and can be partners in peace. Now, that is my utopia. And so if those people agree with my utopia, that's great, but I don't think they do. I don't think that's where they're at. So I don't accept the nihilistic view of which state pick one. And so if you don't accept that, there is only one natural conclusion, I'm afraid, that is logical and that doesn't mean war, which is the two-state solution. That's it.
A lot of us here will have been attending the vigils every week and signing petitions and things. Is there anything clearly, especially in light of what's happened this week, that we can be doing to take action, because again we can often feel very hopeless, that we can be doing that is of practical benefit, especially in the coming weeks, apart from pestering Alistair in our emails, I'm sure?
Yes. I won't speak for Alistair, but for me, I mean, I find it useful when my constituents write in simply to say, I really agree with you. You know, so when I get, 100 emails saying this week, stop arms trade for Israel and whatever else, like, actually that's very helpful to an MP, because we're able to then say, it's not just my opinion, it's the opinion, I'm carrying the weight of my constituents' views with me. And so genuinely that does help. And it doesn't just go into an inbox and an ether somewhere. We take notice, and it matters, because we can then raise it, and it encourages us to have heart. And as this drags on, it's getting wearing, not least for the people in Gaza and the people who are there. And so we have to, find our energy, and we get our energy from our constituents. So certainly from my perspective, I welcome that, even if it's from the same person who again says thank you and just keep going. Like, it really matters. On a very practical level beyond that, though, I mean, we're working on a number of things. Arms is one of them. There's very specific campaigns. Al-Shifa Hospital, we saw what was happening a couple of weeks ago. Like, I'm actively fighting for a couple of the boys who are there, who are amputees, trying to get them out so that they can get proper medical attention and reunification with their families. So there's all sorts of stuff that's happening behind the scenes. I think in terms of, for you, two things that I would encourage you to do. One, consider your social media echo bubble, okay? We're probably finding, and we all know that social media does this very well. You like something and then someone else comes on your feed and So for those of us who are using social media, I would just urge you to consider what I said about those Israeli voices in Israel who are also on our side, or indeed across the world. Find people who you think might be confounding in the debate, who, you would expect that they would be saying one thing and they're actually saying something else. And perhaps don't just like the people who already agree with you in the way that you agree. Maybe find someone who's saying it slightly differently, or is coming from a background that you think your friends need to hear from. So try and break through that, and I think that's incredibly powerful. But the other thing is to just say you're not going to give up, that you're going to keep doing, if you've been doing fundraising, people like, I support all sorts of charities, Medical Aid for Palestine are an incredible one, yeah. Save the Children are doing great work. We are going to need an enormous amount of money and energy, especially if governments continue to defund UNRWA, which is the refugee agency. Now, for those who are perhaps slightly less familiar, there were issues that were alleged by Israel against certain members of UNRWA. They've yet to produce proper reports on that, unfortunately, but there is an interim report that says that there are some issues with UNRWA, but actually, by and large, we can't be painting the whole organisation with the same brush. Britain is looking for an excuse, as far as I can see from Parliament, to refund UNRWA, but America has said, and in fact has just passed legislation saying that it won't. So in its wake is going to have to be money that comes in, but money going to Gaza without UNRWA is money going down a black hole, because only UNRWA can actually distribute the aid within Gaza itself. So continue to press Alistair to press about UNRWA, because that's what we can do, but we are going to need to find new sources of money for people like UNRWA so that we can alleviate some of that strife that we're seeing in Palestine at the moment.
Can I add to that, actually? You've teed me up for the opportunity to ingratiate myself with our hosts.
Yes.
But Orkney Friends of Palestine and Amnesty International Orkney are a really important part of this. And the work that OFOP in particular has done supporting Gaynor Jones and her work in Shufat is enormously important, not just for the impact that it has in Shufat, but also because it brings attention to the situation, not just when it's acute like it is at the moment, but when it's dropped out the news agenda, and actually also because it gives a human understanding. One of the biggest problems in this is that we slap labels on people and we treat them all as if they're some homogenous mass, and they're not. So that building of human understanding and reminding, Nadia, we worked years ago about building an understanding between Orkney farmers and farmers in the West Bank, because I can tell you, speaking as a farmer's son, wherever you go in the world, farmers are all the same. You can tell the second you're in the presence of a farmer. So that work that OFOP and Amnesty do in taking it out of the abstract political and making it real and human, actually, I think is very, very important. Joe's telling me that we should be going soon.
Yes.
I said we'd be out at 7 o'clock. It's now 4 minutes past, so I reckon we've got another 5 minutes.
I was just going to actually, I'm afraid we probably don't have time for any more questions unless there is one from our online audience, since we did invite them. No? Okay. Right. Well, I think we probably
Joe,
have
to
one
take the
more.
two that you've got,
Right,
if
one
we
more
take them both
question.
together,
Yep.
and we'll do them very
Right,
quickly.
Stuart, go ahead.
Sorry, it's not a question. Can I just suggest there's a bit of paper somewhere on the way out that anybody here who's not already involved in the local Amnesty group or Friends of Palestine but would be interested in being part of it, can they please put their email address or whatever on there, so that the interest that's been generated by this fantastic meeting this evening can be kind of built on locally, and people that want to get involved can get involved.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. And that
was Chris.
Chris, did you have one?
Or Joe.
I just wanted to ask, I hear repeatedly that the Palestinian Authority and Fatah don't have credibility. I really would have liked your comment on that. I'm sorry it's so late.
Yeah, happy to do that. I spoke in one of the answers to the other question about Palestinian civil society, and it's fair to say that the Palestinian Authority in particular has zero credibility with Palestinians. Zero. They are considered corrupt. They are considered to be bad actors who are there for their own gain rather than wanting to deliver peace. Now, they would say differently, and I've met with them, but that is the fact of how they are seen by Palestinians on the ground. The reason why that's happened is a little bit twofold. One is that they have refused to renew their mandate with the Palestinian people. Now, people point to elections, but we all know that democracy isn't just about the ballot box. It's also about accessibility. It's also about when you write to your MP or your representative and you say, I need a permit for my cask or whatever, that they work doubly hard to try and get it to you. Instead, what we saw, and the reason why the corruption charge is leveled at some of them, is that they would ignore you, and instead they'd give it to their brother or their son or whatever else. And so I think some of that criticism is actually justified. And there is criticism that is due to the current Palestinian Authority leaders. You might have seen that the Prime Minister has resigned. They are understanding now that if they are going to be part of in some way, and so the Palestinian Authority is kind of the government, but actually the political arm is called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, of which Fatah is one, but not the only one. Hamas is not part of it, although they are trying to find a way to include elements of Hamas if they are willing to relinquish any of their sort of terrorist nihilistic aims. And I think that's right. You know, we have seen across the world, whenever we've had conflicts like this, if you want to make peace, you're going to have to include some of those who did bad things but have now realized the errors of their ways to come into that tent. And I think that's something that people are going to have to just understand and accept on the ground. But it is true to say, when people criticize that there is a lack of partner on the Palestinian side, that is true. That doesn't mean that Palestinians are incapable of being a partner, nor that they don't want peace. But there is a problem there that needs to be solved. It can be solved by elections where the whole of Jerusalem is allowed to vote at the same time as everyone else. Some of this is designed by the Israeli government to actively undermine the Palestinian people. Some of it is designed by the occupation itself. And actually, I would say if you want to do all of that, you have to also keep talking about lifting the occupation as quickly as possible, because you can't have one really without the other. So yes, there is a problem. Yes, we need renewal. We need good people to be coming forwards, and we need free and fair elections in Palestine. But Palestinians are hungry for it. So the issue here is not Palestinians. The issue here is the ecosystem in which Palestinian democracy works. I hope that has made a very complex issue a little bit clearer.
Thank you so much, Layla and Alistair, for your insight tonight. Just a quick plug for some campaigns we have on at the moment as people are wanting to do more. There are collection tins at the back of the room there for Hope and Play, which is a British charity that supports traumatized children in Gaza. And they're doing good work even now under the onslaught that's going on there, providing support for displaced families and play for children who are displaced. So, you know, we would encourage people to support them if you like. Brian has information about Hope and Play at the back. Then we have Amnesty International. Sue is there. She has greetings cards that our artist and activist friend Susie Shearer has designed for our group. And they're 5 beautiful designs. So if you'd like to purchase some of those, they will help the Orkney group. There's also a fact sheet that Ed has about how people can get involved and support Amnesty, Orkney Friends of Palestine, and other ideas for action. And finally, we have a beautiful painting that Susie Shearer has done about our Orkney Gaza vigils that take place every Saturday at 1 o'clock in front of the cathedral. And over the weeks, people have been signing messages on the back, which we then send as photographs to our friends in Palestine so that they have encouragement and know that people in Orkney and in Britain are thinking about them and sending good wishes. This Saturday is a special event at the vigil. It's the International Kites for Gaza Day, and Orkney will be taking part. People can bring along a kite or a representation of a kite. In 2011, I think it was, children in Gaza flew 13,000 kites, and they made it into the Guinness Book of World Records. Now, sadly, over that number now of children have been killed in Gaza since October, which is absolutely astonishing and cruel. So people all over the world are going to be flying kites on Saturday to show people in Gaza that we are thinking of them. And a kite, for Palestinians is a symbol of freedom. So we would encourage people to come along. After the vigil, people can go down to the PDC and actually fly their kites way into the air. So thank you everyone tonight who's here in person and those online. Once again, our great gratitude to Layla and Alistair for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for all.